Hi, I'm Dr. Mike, and this is NFGeeks. Well, this video is an Ask Dr. Mike video. Every Sunday on the NFGeeks Facebook forum, people ask questions to be answered in a video by me, and whoever gets the most likes wins. And this video is for Bruno Samadiato, who's had a lot of luck at NFGeeks lately. You know, things are going good for him. And his question won, and here's his question, and hopefully a very good answer. So he asks, in what ways can a psychological trauma affect type? And what types are most prone to developing psychological disorders due to trauma? Well, this is a great question, and I really like questions like this because I'm always very interested in what the connection is between psychological trauma and mental health and therapy and personality type, how these two things go together and how you can use personality type to get to the bottom of mental health problems and use it in therapy and things like that. So this really connects with me, and so I'm glad to answer it. Now, before we get into that relationship, what is the relationship between type and mental health stuff, I want to kind of define some terms. So the first one I want to define is, what constitutes an abnormal behavior, meaning what constitutes a mental health diagnosis. Okay, when they're thinking about, when the American Psychological Association is thinking about what's going to be a diagnosis, in the DSM-4 or whatever, 5, whatever one we're up to now, I think it's 5, whatever the DSM is, what criteria are they looking at? And there's 3 basic things they're looking at, very simple. These are the 3 minimal things, and they are 3 things, and here they are. One is deviancy. Okay, does the behavior or process or emotions, whatever, lead to being outside of social norms? Okay, does it put them outside of that? That's item 1. 2, relationships. Does the behavior or process or emotions interfere with relationships with others? Now, it's not just family and friends and lovers, the basic ones work, but even relationships outside of that, simple short relationships like dealing with somebody at the cash register and whatever, how many human relationships are disrupted because of this behavior, this process, these feelings. And the last part, and this is easy, does it cause stress? Is this thing causing stress? So that would result in a a mental health diagnosis, something that met those criteria. Okay, that's important because that relates a lot to type. Secondly, the thing we have to define is post-traumatic stress disorder, because the question asks about trauma and the effects of trauma. Well, the effects of trauma are post-traumatic stress disorder, all the various symptoms of that. So we kind of have to talk about what that is, at least just a little bit. Post-traumatic stress disorder is when you are all sort of the psychological problems that are a result of an extreme psychological trauma. And the trauma is so extreme that it cannot be processed or understood or related to or in any way that is useful when the event is taking place. Okay, so you can't wrap your mind around it because the psychological trauma is so horrible that there's no way to even cope in the moment with it, and then that leads to problems down the road, sort of rippling out. Okay, and that includes a lot of things. It includes flashbacks. Okay, and a re-experiencing of the event, and I think that's because the memory of it becomes shady. And that has to do with dissociation. As it's happening or even afterwards, you often dissociate from a psychological trauma, which means you sort of cognitively separate out a certain memory or a certain process from the rest of the stuff. And that creates a separation where you kind of remember it, but you kind of don't, but it's still affecting you. The Freudian term would have been repression. That's not exactly a parallel term, but kind of is, But anyway, something gets, severed, but it's still present and affecting everything else, but you can't have access to it to fix it or to do anything about it. A lot of therapy is about incorporating these parts into ourselves. Okay, it's because when you incorporate it into you, you can do something with it because you can't get rid of it. You can't get rid of a traumatic event. You can't get rid of the memory of a traumatic event. But you can bring a memory of the traumatic event back into something so that you can deal with it better. Okay, that's actually the whole point of therapy is actually doing that to some degree. Um, so things are very shattered. Memory is shattered. And so that's why when triggers come up, like having flashback memories or any kind of thing that brings something back, it's bringing back sort of a shard, a piece of that memory. It's not, the memory hasn't been erased. It's just been severed from certain things. So, okay, but the pieces of them still exist. And when they get triggered, they come up. And they could be triggered by the environment in any way, sound, smells, anything, can trigger it. So. Now, this also leads to a variety of irrational thought processes. Thoughts are meant to do, to problem solve things, and the traumatic event interferes with that, and it creates misbelief mechanisms like overgeneralizing, minimizing, labeling, things like that. There's a whole list of them that go on. It also leads to very destructive behaviors, such as drug abuse, addiction, and self-mutilation. A lot of self-mutilation is about post-traumatic stress disorder in a lot of ways. So that's important. Okay, so those are the two things. So what's the relationship? Well, one of the things that happens is that when we talk about type and trauma and mental health is that we put them in relation to each other in such a way that the type becomes an insult to the person for whatever reason. Okay, it becomes something out of that's sort of talked about out of anger, or just in a way to sort of put them down and things like that. Not necessarily on purpose, being frustrated with the other person. It's your fault because you're a jackass. This is happening. It's that kind of thing. It's labeling the person. And one of the ways is that it labels is that type is made to be the foundational truth or position of mental health. So in other words, you have this type like ENFP, and then out of it comes some sort of mental health issue, emotional issue, mood disorders or whatever, but it comes from this thing that is sort of innately wrong. And it's not changeable, and it's at the bottom, it's at the source, it's at the the logos of your soul, if you will, and it's there, and everything that comes out of it is bad, and there's nothing you can do. So if you are an ENFP, that's it, you're locked in, okay, to the mental health trauma, whatever's coming out of that. The other part is the reverse, which is not any better, and that's saying that the mental health problem, that's the foundational thing, whatever that is, PTSD or whatever, and your type is a symptom of that. So you have a type because you're mentally ill. So type is a reflection of mental illness. It's a symptom of mental illness, and that's just as bad. So it's seen in two ways. It's either the ground floor of mental illness, mental illness just pops up out of it, and because it's a ground floor, it's not changeable. It's innate. It's even metaphysical, maybe. Or it's a symptom. It's the outcrop of some kind of mental health disorder. And so if you are a certain type, like ENFP, that assumes that underneath that is a mental health disorder because ENFP is the top surface of that. Okay. Both aren't too nice, no matter what type we're talking about. So what is the relationship? So what I think it is, and I think this is the relationship of type to anything, not just trauma, so this is a good thing to talk about, is that I think the relationship is that the type acts as a conduit or a bridge or a pipe, if you will. So it is the connection between trauma and the self or consciousness or whatever. So trauma comes in, trauma occurs, it goes in through type, okay? So type becomes the thing that sort of shapes it and takes it into the consciousness. Trauma is shaped by type. It's not it affects by type, but it's shaped by type. Trauma travels through type to get to something. And then whatever mental health problems that come out in terms of feelings or behaviors or whatever travels through the type, okay? So it comes out through the type. So type is the way things go through to get to the mind, and it's the thing that the mind sends things through to get outside, okay? And what we're talking about here is trauma, all right? Now that's an important concept. Let's get a little conceptual for a minute, because the question assumes something that a lot of people assume about type, which is that type is a thing. Okay, it's a thing, I can touch it, I can manifest it, and I don't think that it's a thing. Because the impression is like, okay, here's this thing, it's called, ENFP, and here comes the psychological trauma, and it's now altered, it's changed in some way. And I don't think that's the case. I think that ENFP, or any type, let's talk about type, any type is actually a design. It's a design of something, it's not the thing itself, okay, which means it can't be altered, all right? It's more like a blueprint than it is the thing. Let's say you have a blueprint of a car and you have a car, okay? So you have these two things, and you crash the car into a tree, you total it. You don't total the picture of the blueprint. the blueprint stays the same. It's not, it's not altered in any way, So it's not something that can be changed. All right, the brain can be changed, but but that type cannot be changed. That's why it's sort of constant over time, because it's not actually something physical. It's a design of a way things can operate and connect to each other. Okay, so I see it as the conduit. Trauma goes in through the type, and trauma comes out through the type. Okay, and that's the real relationship to it. Type does change it. Okay, if I'm having trauma, okay, it's going to psychological trauma. It's going to come in through my introverted feeling, okay, and it's going to hit it's going to become an emotional memory, that's for sure. And then it's going to come out conceptually, okay, because I speak conceptually, so it's going to come out, conceptually in that way, It's going to affect my ENFP behaviors, okay, in one way or another. But the ENFP is not changed. Okay, ENFP is just the way it's shaped going in, and then whatever's going to manifest out in terms of behavior and feelings, that will shape it. Okay, so my expression of PTSD is going to be pretty extroverted, for example. Simplistic, but that's the example of that. Okay, so now the next part was what types are most prone to developing psychological disorders due to trauma. Well, this is my own experience. This isn't theoretical in terms of how the functions act, but this has been my experience. Certainly, I think anybody who has some introverted thing going on, like introverted thinking or introverted feeling, I think has some tough time with it. I think that's important to know. I guess any of the feelers probably have a hard time with it, but I find that introverted feelers have a hard time, and I find that the ESFP, the ESFP, the ISFP, the INFP, and the ENFP, I find have a lot of PTSD problems. It hits them hard, and they have a hard time overcoming it. Okay, and specifically, I would say ISFP, and the one who experiences the worst, I think, is INFP. I think INFP has the hardest time. If I had to rank it, I would put INFP a little bit ahead of ISFP in terms of trauma, because they easily fall into flashbacks. Okay, now I say this, okay, this isn't theoretical. I know a lot of INFPs, okay, lots of INFPs, and a lot of INFPs I've met through either my mental health experience or just in my capacity as a teacher. Okay, they're not necessarily people that I know personally, but I know, so I've met a lot of INFPs, and the ones that have trauma have a really tough time. And one of the things I think it is because they're NFs, they go into this very imaginative place about whatever the trauma is. So when they're having a flashback, they're having a flashback. Okay, their imagination is kicking in hardcore. Okay, and because they're such deep feelers, they're having a deeply emotional response to their own imaginative event. So it seems very, very real to them. Okay, seems very real. Now, to give example of this, and this is kind of comical, but I've experienced this with INFPs, and this is why I'm cutting them slack here. It's a very big deal. Is that I have had INFPs, or let me put it this way. Sometimes INFPs have a dream about a person, okay, and something bad happens in the dream. The person was a jerk, and then when they wake up, they're in the world. They're kind of still mad at the person, even though it was just a dream. And that's because they had this deep emotional experience as if it really happened, because of that FI. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be a dream. They'll be playing out something in their mind, okay, and imagine what it's like and be mad if a person acted that way, and then have that emotional reaction as if it really happened. Okay, I've seen this a lot with INFP. Now, when that happens, it's kind of comical. But if we're talking about PTSD, it's not funny. Okay, it's not funny at all, because some real horrible suffering is taking place. I think the same thing happens with the ISFP, but it's not as imaginative. I don't think they go into an imaginative place. They just have the sensual experience of something that smelled the same way or something that looked the same way. You know what I mean? I think just it's a sense trigger. But in the INFP, the whole narrative comes back in some way. Everything comes back. Who, what, where, when, how, why, all of it. The questions that they asked as it was happening come out. It goes into that place. Again, it's not just because they're feeling it deeply, but their intuitiveness is creating the imaginary state of what it is. And so it's very, very difficult for them. Now, that's not to say that the other types don't have PTSD. Of course, they have PTSD. We all have a little PTSD, on some level. So, for example, one of the things that happens with emotional memories, like for me, and these aren't PTSD things, okay? But just giving an example of some things that might happen with introverted feeling is that because feelings are and memories are one. Remember, I said that in another video, they're going in. I get emotionally attached to places like locations, especially if they involve certain people. Okay, and and this is tough because again, I only have ex-girlfriends. I just have this string. So if there's a place that I went specifically with an ex-girlfriend and only that person to that place, I can't go there again. Okay, I cannot go because it brings up the relationship and the sadness and the sorrow. So I don't go. There's a lot of places I don't go. And look, I have a lot of relationships now. A lot of places I can't go. My world is starting. I got to move because my world is shrinking. It's shrinking down. This is true. I have all sorts of things like that. Noah thinks it's hysterical. He's like, Dad, can we go? No, I can't go. Why? Well, me and the doctor went to that restaurant. Like, he thinks it's stupid. It's funny. You should hear him. But that's my sort of trigger. I get triggered by locations because I attach an emotional memory to the location. So and that's now I'm grateful because it's just silly, brokenhearted, nobody loves me kind of nonsense. But I always think, my God, what if it was like sexual abuse? What if it was I witnessed a murder? What if it was something of extreme psychological trauma? God, I'd never be able to go there again. I can feel it on the way there. I mean, sometimes I'm getting close to something like, God, corners of that place, I'll change the way I'm driving. Like, I'll go down a different road just so I don't go by a certain thing or a certain place. Okay, now again, this is just stupid shit. This is just stupid romantic stuff. It's nothing. Imagine what it's like now for PTSD, and now take that and add it to the INFP and their problems with it and dealing with it. That's very, very hard to do so. Now, that's just the emotional thing, though. Do I think, like, the NTs or the thinkers, do they get PTSD? Well, of course they do. I mean, anybody can get PTSD. The real question is what goes on in terms of the type that allows them to either get over it or cope with it or whatever. Like, I think a lot of NTs kind of get lost in their mind. They sort of become alienated and they go into that dark room where where they're thinking up shit and they're building robots or whatever it is they do, But they go into that place and they don't come out, for a while. And that actually leads to another thing that I think about in terms of all this, and that is that, because one of the things that goes on is people kind of ask or think that, if you're under mental duress, emotional duress, so you have mental health issues, then all the weaknesses go up, all the weaknesses become very, very strong, and then all the strengths go way down like this. And I don't think that's what happens. Really thinking about this, I think what happens is you get this amplification of all the traits. Let's assume that the traits themselves are neutral. So all the traits of the type are just neutral things, okay? I think that mental health issues, especially PTSD, which is all this, anxiety, because that's what really PTSD is. It's like an anxiety disorder that's interconnected with everything. This major anxiety disorder is flying out of people, and I think it amplifies all of the traits and behaviors of a type, and that causes it to spiral out of control because there's too much energy behind it. So, for example, let's take INTJ. Okay, and I'm speculating here, but this is my example of how it would work. An INTJ may suffer PTSD. And because of that, and anxiety and things like that, and becoming OCD, I could see INTJs becoming very OCD. They sort of retreat and become more alienated and more isolated and a little more paranoid. You know what I mean? They sort of get away from people and don't know how to interact with people. Kind of go away from that. Now, while they're in that space, that gives them plenty of time to think up all sorts of stuff and to create something and to be, and build a better mousetrap and all sorts of things. It gives their thinking side an ability to go crazy. You know what I mean? To really, really get out there. Or I should even say, actually, they're intuitive, because it's really the conceptual stuff. It allows that to go in a way stronger than it might have before, because they're not interacting with people. They got all this time on their hands. Okay? Now, though, because of that, they create this thing, this system, They go out into the world, they try to explain it. It's too complex. They're already a little socially atrophied anyway from the trauma. And what does that do? That then creates a feedback loop. That sends them back in socially withdrawing, more paranoia, more alienation. But that gives them more time to concoct whatever it is they're concocting in their mind. And it could be anything. It could be music. I mean, it could be anything. You know, a symphony. But whatever it is, they're now way back in the recesses of their mind. And then, you know, then they're even weirder now. It's even harder for them to interact with people. They go out. They have a difficult time. So now it's even more complex. Nobody gets it. That brings them back in. They concoct other things. You know, it gets caught in this feedback loop. And what happens is, I think eventually that flies out of control, okay, and falls apart. You know, it's like something with a centrifugal force. You know, you spin it around enough times, as fast it'll go, eventually it'll rip apart. You can see that with planes. I mean, you know, when a plane starts to rip apart, it starts going faster. The more force that's exerted on the plane, the more it starts to rip itself apart and spin faster and faster and faster until it crashes, okay? So I think that's what happens. I think that things get amplified through type, and both the strengths and the weaknesses, and they basically set each other off in a feedback loop, and they spin harder and harder and harder, and that causes it to crash. Now, the last thing I want to say is that you might say, well, geez, you know, what if this was like Beethoven, okay? And you know, I've talked about this with others, that Beethoven was probably an INTJ. I think so. I think he was an NT. So what if this is like the next Beethoven, and he writes this, or she writes this amazing symphony, okay, very, very complex thing, while they're in this paranoid, isolated state, and isn't that a good thing? And my answer is, yeah, that might be a great thing for the world, but is it a good thing for that INTJ? You know, I mean, yes, they created this massive, you know, 7-hour symphony, you know, amazing piece of artwork, but, you know, at what cost? You know, what was the cost for that one INTJ, you know, who suffered a psychological trauma and then became lost in their own thinking and their own music? You know, yeah, we all benefit, but, you know, look what happened to them, you know, just to have this symphony. So that's my answer to that. So yes, the product may be good, but what happened to the person to create that product may not be so good. And that could happen with any type. So, all right, so that's my answer. And Bruno, I hope your luck continues. All right, thanks everybody.